The Warrior Witches of Ukraine's Resistance, which is an extraordinary piece about the resistance in Ukraine, which you don't read about a lot for a lot of reasons. But Ken, thanks for joining, and let's talk about this latest piece.
Yeah, well, it's great to be here. Thank you. And I have to say the bravery is entirely accidental. Every time I get thrown into one of these situations where the guys are telling me what we're about to do, my first response is always, "We're going to do what?" And at that point,
most people just call you crazy, so that's okay. It's all right. Yeah.
But yeah, this latest piece has been a couple years in the making, and honestly, I think it couldn't have been done any quicker than that, because building up the kind of trust you need to get the access to these members of the resistance, it takes time, and they're putting a lot on the line by trusting someone like me to tell their story. But it's really important, I think, to begin by saying they want this story told now. It's very important that this story gets out now. They've been very reluctant over the past few years since the start of the full-scale invasion, honestly, since 2014. But for a couple of reasons, they think now's the time. First of all, Russia is on its back foot, especially in these occupied territories. Just crack a newspaper, look at what's happening in Crimea, much less Mariupol and the other occupied territories. And if you study resistance movements throughout history, when they're in a position like this, what the resistance needs to do is make them paranoid. And there was one agent in particular I talked to from occupied Mariupol, codenamed Sestra, who put it really poetically. She said she wants that Russian soldier paranoid, afraid every minute of every day, wondering if that old lady carrying shopping bags home from the market, wondering if the baker, wondering if the dentist is part of a plan to kill them. They want the Russians to be that afraid. They also want Americans to know that they are fighting for their whole country, not just the parts that we hear about, see about on the news. They are fighting for Mariupol. They are fighting for Crimea. They are fighting for the East. It's all Ukraine, and it's not just about land for them. It's about people, because they know what happens under the Russian boot. When they are challenged about this idea to maybe surrender land for peace, their response is pretty compelling. They say, look at Bucha. Look at the theater in Mariupol. That is not peace. We're fighting for the entire Ukraine.
Yeah, when I first heard you were doing this, my first question was, why do they want this story told? And I thought it was very interesting and compelling what you're saying, that they want it known that they are fighting for the whole country. And it's so counter to this Trump idea that, let's just call it, blow the whistle and say it's over and they get to keep what they have. We could have done that in 1944 and it wouldn't have worked out well. And there's no reason to think that it'll work out. Reason to think it'd be worse now for the Ukrainians. So talk to me as much as you can about this, how you built this trust, I'm always fascinated about how stories are told like this. Because this is true journalism. This is a dedicated long-term project, earning trust, telling stories that no one else is telling. And that's pretty rare these days. So how did it begin? What was your first contact to get into this secret world?
Well, like all the best stories, it began accidentally. It began as I was chasing something seemingly unrelated. I was interviewing a special forces general because I have always been fascinated with leadership and leadership challenges. And I wanted to understand from him what it is like sending men and women on suicide missions, on these missions from which they're very unlikely to return. And he gave it kind of a passing answer. He said, it's actually not that hard. Most of the guys that I send on these missions, they think of themselves as dead already. What bothers me, this is the general talking, are the kids. And at first I assumed he was talking about what kids have to endure through this war, they have to endure as a result of the Russian occupation. But he was talking about the kids who were fighting back. He was talking about kids who were part of the resistance, providing information to his special forces teams. And that led me down this rabbit hole and meeting groups of young people initially in liberated areas. So the right bank of Kherson, 3 teenage sisters in particular who led a resistance cell in Kherson, simply because they had a bedroom window overlooking a bridge that for 9 months was the most important bridge in the world, because it was the Russians' main artery for resupply into Kherson, and they provided a steady stream of intel to the resistance and helped drive the Russians out of Kherson. But the story of the resistance always was in the back of my mind. How are they doing this? How are they pulling off these incredible strikes deep behind enemy lines? And it was when the unfolding drone campaign finally broke into the open, into the public consciousness, and people are probably familiar now with all of these videos of drone strikes against Russian targets. The M14 highway resupplying Crimea has been shut down, has been cut off because of these middle strike drone hits. And that's just the last link in a very long kill chain. The first link and the second link and all the other links up to that is this intel network. The spies, the agents deep behind enemy lines, gathering this intelligence, feeding it to the Ukrainian military. There's an entire vetting system that is set up. That's fascinating in its own right. I can speak to that. But I wanted to tell the story about the people behind enemy lines. And when I first started to ask, that's when the door started to open and made me realize maybe this is a story that can be told. And the first question I always asked was, why? Why would you talk to me? Why would you take the risk? And it was when they said, we are looking for someone to tell this story now, that I decided to go for it and to meet with some of the people who are at the heart of this story.
And just in this process, how particularly in the occupied territories, how do you meet them, Ken? Is it how do you communicate with them as much as you can talk about it? How?
Yeah, well, a lot I can't talk about. A lot of material, as they say, wound up on the cutting room floor, and I hope someday I get to tell some of these stories, because they are, truly extraordinary. As mind-blowing as the piece that turned out is, there's stuff that I have to hold on to. But most of the communication initially, setting up the story, figuring out how I was going to tell it, was over encrypted chat. And almost all of the commanders of the resistance are in free Ukraine. So I was able to meet with them in person on my last trip, because they're not going to risk a commander inside the occupied territories. In fact, the agents in the occupied territories, they operate in cells that are basically the realization of the logical minimum of a resistance cell. It's one person per cell. And you can be an agent in occupied Mariupol, for example. Your only contact is via an encrypted app with your handler in free Ukraine. And you won't even know that there are 5 other agents in your apartment complex, except for the fact that Russians around you are dying every day. As Sestra, this agent in Mariupol, told me, you cannot give away under interrogation what you don't know. So it's totally unlike the French resistance or other resistance movements, in that the FSB's, the Russian intelligence agencies, surveillance is so tight that they can't have communities of resistors in the occupied territories. They are operating as cells of one, providing intel directly to their handlers, who feed it to the Ukrainian military to supply those middle strike drone strikes.
And what can you describe would be sort of a typical is the wrong word, but they're providing information that's used primarily in targeting, would you say?
Coordinates are a main type of information that's being provided, especially when you're talking about feeding the drone campaign. there are a number of ways they can get them. One of the story begins with a catfishing operation, a 35-year-old housewife, lonely in her marriage, chatting up online a Chechen commander in the occupied South, asking him for information about his life. She's lonely. She shares about her life. He shares about his. One of the photos he sends, which was sent to me, I actually have this photo, is of him and a buddy in the barracks with a grainy image of a map of the barracks showing its coordinates over his shoulder. Shortly after that photo was sent, the barracks was struck by a drone. So that is one way they get intelligence. Other ways are just simply observation. And this is why the warrior witches play such an important role. The warrior witches are the women of the resistance who have come to form the backbone of this intelligence network. And the Russian military, I assume much like Russian society, is still deeply chauvinistic, and women can do things and go places that men cannot. And for a variety of reasons, that being probably near the top of the list, women are the backbone of this intelligence gathering apparatus, just through observation, just through noticing unusual traffic patterns. They have also infiltrated, and they wanted this known as well. And you can imagine how something like this F's with the morale of Russian units. They have infiltrated these volunteer groups that supply care packages to Russian units at the front. And now you have Ukrainian agents delivering care packages to Russian positions. There's no better intel gathering mechanism than that. They have to be very careful, of course, between the delivery of something like that and the strike, but their capacity for innovation is astonishing.